Our 64th Warframe Follie is honestly incredibly powerful with an insanely synergistic, mildly chaotic ability skill set, and really impressive damage output for either playing her as a caster, weapon platform, or hybrid as I generally prefer. She's incredibly durable, invincible even if you're on top of your casting, and with a wide variety of items that she can summon into being, she brings a truly insane amount of damage and utility to many mission types in Warframe, and with smart play, she'll be an incredibly powerful frame to fit any kind of playstyle. She's got invincibility, crazy movement tech, Gmod admin summon powers, squad support, defense strip, nuking capabilities, she's got it all and more. So let's go over her abilities so that you can truly understand just how bonkers she is, and then let's get into a few builds for you all to try out and get some inspiration for your own build. Before that, just a quick special thank you to all of you who are YouTube members for the extra support. I really appreciate it, and I hope that you're enjoying this video without ads. First up is her passive, which is both great and can be a bit frustrating at the same time. Enemies who are affected by her abilities get a debuff that will slow them by 50% and have a 20% chance to drop a mixture of 3 health and energy orbs on death, meaning that when you bring along an Equilibrium or some Violet Archon shards, she'll basically never run out of energy. However, as that slow is applied by all of her abilities, it can cause some issues with enemy movement and slowing down mission speeds depending on the range that you've equipped her with, so keep that in mind when you're playing and building her out. Her first ability, Force Perspective, is an incredible survivability and movement ability, and if used properly, makes her basically invincible. When cast, you'll teleport through an inky canvas to the target location, pop out, dealing a bit of corrosive damage to enemies in range, applying the ink blots to enemies for her passive, and granting her about 4 seconds of invulnerability starting when she first casts the ability, and when it's cast, it'll also cleanse her of any status effects. Keep in mind that cast speed improvement does speed up the animation for Force Perspective, and won't decrease the invulnerability time, so it might be a good idea to run some Amber Archon shards on her if you're wanting to focus on this ability. Her second ability, Shadowgraph, could take up an entire video on its own with how completely bonkers it is, but let's do our best to quickly summarize it here. When you hold cast the ability, you'll pop up this radial wheel in which you can select various items to paint into being, and once selected it'll automatically be summoned at the target location, applying ink for her passive to nearby enemies, and then we'll make tap casting the ability summon the last item that you selected on cast. The various items include one random explosive barrel, which is either blast, gas, or cold, and will deal damage and apply their status effects to all enemies within 10 meters, the cold barrel dealing 10 stacks of cold and the others applying 1 gas or blast, an arc trap that will electrocute nearby enemies 10 times before expiring, dealing electric damage and status effects to all enemies in range, and you can have up to 3 active at once, a Thermian RPG from Hovania, 3 random alchemy amphors which you can pick up and throw at enemies, a death orb that spins, dealing radiation damage and status effects and gives prime frames the death orb free energy when they walk close to it, a Coralizer turret that will deal cold damage and status effects to enemies in range, a Loke Surge totem that you can interact with to get random buffs from the Sanctum Atonomica for you and your squad, except for the infinite ammo and increased fire rate one, an ammo dispenser that will spit out universal ammo packs every 5 seconds, a launch pad if you feel like bouncing on a crazy style dio of which you can have up to 3 deployed at once, the Lost Spirit Child from the Zarman who will lead you to collectibles or items in missions, a life support capsule from survival missions which will also spawn the survival mission speed up tool, power cells for excavators, a freaking defense objective which is great for distracting enemies, and lastly disruption keys for that mission type. For all of the items, the only thing that will affect them is duration for those items that have duration, making them last on the field for extended period of time if modded for that. Range will increase the AoE of the ink for the passive on initial cast, but doesn't affect the actual summoned items in any way, strength doesn't affect the items at all, and efficiency will decrease the energy cost of her Shadowgraph. Nearly all of the items that deal damage do maximum health percentage damage to enemies, making them incredible at all levels of the game. For instance, the Cold and Blast explosive barrels will each deal 65% of the enemy's maximum health to all enemies when they pop, meaning that with 2 barrels, it will finish off every enemy within 10 meter range as long as there's not an Xmas unit nearby giving them damage reduction. And while we're talking a bit more, here's all of the damaging items numbers on screen for you, being damage per instance, and the Amphor's damage is a bit random and weird, but they do a lot of it. Most of the items don't do a ton of damage to mini bosses like the Stalker Acolytes, but the Thermian RPG is fantastic for those enemies, as unlike the other summoned items, they deal direct damage, not percentage-based damage, which those mini bosses seem to be resistant to. Also, Rhino's Roar will increase all of the items' damage, and the ability damage increasing Archon shards like the Violets, Emeralds, or Topaz will affect the summoned items. Additionally, some of the items have cooldowns, meaning that you can't spam those ones, which here's a list on screen with each of their individual cooldowns, and you're unable to reduce their cooldowns through modding. As you might have noticed, specifically the barrels and arc traps don't have cooldowns, so if you're wanting to do funny caster things with Shadowgraph, those are the ones that I personally focus on with their insane damage output and spammability. You can have up to 3 barrels, arc traps, and launch pads active at once, and all other items are limited to 1 at a time except for the alchemy amphors, which will summon 3 at a time. If you're summoning the mission specific items like life support capsules or excavator power cells and not those mission types, they won't do anything, but when used properly in their respective missions, they can be clutch for lasting in those missions or speeding them up by giving you those extra critical resources. Also, as a side note about the defense objective, which you might think is an odd choice to add into her kit. Defense objectives have one of the highest threats in the game to enemies, forcing them to target and focus on it rather than you and your allies, making it a surprisingly useful survivability mechanic if you're wanting to utilize it. It's also worth noting that all of the items that can apply status effects will activate conditional arcanes in mods such as Arcane Impetus, Ice Storm, or the Archon mods, giving her some pretty neat combinations. Now, I've probably missed something in there because there's just so much to this ability, so let me know in the comments if I missed anything really important. You can also customize the appearance of the item's icons on the radial wheel with this option in your arsenal, but keep in mind that others can see the icon when you summon the item, and if you've drawn something against Warframe's terms of service, you can be reported and yeeted with a classic 2035 ban, aka lifetime ban, so keep it clean out there. Her third ability, Self-Portrait, is both great and honestly rather annoying because of the passive. When cast, it'll summon a giant inky version of herself, applying the ink from her passive to all enemies in range, and give you and all allies within range damage reduction. When you get a kill on an enemy within its radius, it'll increase the amount of damage reduction up to a maximum of 90% at 180% power strength, as well as increase its radius and duration of the ability. Recasting it will resummon the inky clone with the previous clone's range and damage reduction values, so you'll be able to easily maintain it even when you're on a more mobile mission. The problem with Self-Portrait is how it interacts with her passive. With the incredibly high range it gets after a few kills, it'll slow down all enemies within that range by 50%, potentially causing some annoyances in the mission due to that slow. And lastly, her fourth ability, Plein Air, will lift all non-overguard protected enemies in range with some balloons, reducing their armor and shields by up to 100% at 200% ability strength, which will happen even if they're protected by overguard, and does affect mini-bosses like the Stalker's Acolytes. When you shoot at the balloon with direct hits from your weapon, the balloon will pop, dropping the enemy to the ground, and when they land on the ground, they'll take and deal damage in an area around them, and the damage is based on the height that they got to while ballooned. You can also pop the balloons by bouncing on top of them, which is kind of fun, but realistically not something you're going to be using very much. AoE from weapons don't pop the balloons, but flamethrowers like the Ignis Wraith or the Phantasma do, and so will the bouncing glaives from the Cedo Prime, so I've been enjoying using those with Follie for the ease of use of just making the balloons pop super easily. It's also worth noting that most of the Shadowgraph items won't pop the balloons, but if you've got an arc trap down nearby the enemies when you use Plein Air, its status effect AoEs will almost automatically pop the balloons on spawn, removing their defenses as well as activating the balloon's AoE instantly, and with the armor removed, the arc traps will deal more damage. The explosive barrel's damaging status effects can also pop the balloons, but it's a bit irregular, so I wouldn't rely on it. If you haven't popped the balloons after a while, they'll slowly descend to the ground, dealing reduced damage, and if you pop the balloons while they're descending or close to the ground, it can cause a chain reaction of balloon-based destruction. Recasting Plein Air will refresh the balloon's duration on those who are already ballooned, as well as balloon any new enemies in range. Now for playstyle, there's a lot of different ways to enjoy her, and each of my endgame builds will have a bit of a different casting rotation and playstyle, but generally speaking, you'll want to get her self-portrait down as soon as you're able to get the damage reduction rolling for you and your allies, then use your other abilities as needed or wanted. Cast her Plein Air to remove defenses and deal some pretty good AoE damage, use her Force Perspective as needed for its status cleanse, invulnerability time, and movement tech, and then summon items as needed or wanted with her Shadowgraph ability. Easy as that. I'd personally recommend focusing on just one or two of the Shadowgraph items like I do depending on the build, as trying to fully utilize all of her stuff can be a bit overly chaotic. So I'd personally recommend to try not to stress out about fully utilizing each and every item all the time, and focus more on specific items while using others for utility as needed. Before we get into some endgame builds, let's quickly go over some beginner options for those who are earlier into the game with a no Forma, no reactor build, as well as a build with a reactor to double up your mod capacity. Now don't worry about the Forma I have on my Follie here, this will fit into an unformed no reactor build perfectly fine. And if you don't have any of these mods for whatever reason or have spare mod capacity because you don't have some of these fully leveled, just bring in some mods from the Beginner Plus build. For Aura, we're using Dreamer's Bond as its universal polarity mod, so it will bring up your mod capacity from 30 to 44, as well as some additional health and energy restoration, and it's an aura that you get completely free early in the game, so it fits perfectly. Next, we have a Vitality, which should be more than enough for your survivability with all the health orbs that you'll be generating from her passive, refilling your health throughout the mission, using Force Perspective to get out of danger as needed and to make you invulnerable, as well as the damage reduction from Self-Portrait. Next, we have Equilibrium, which will make all those health and energy orbs from her passive give you the other, so if you pick up a health orb, it'll give you energy and vice versa, giving her both additional energy and health sustain. We also have Intensify to increase the damage reduction from her third ability and enemy defense reduction and damage for her balloons, Stretch for a bit more range for her first, third, and fourth ability, and a Continuity to increase the duration of her Shadowgraph items and for her third ability. Once you've got an Orkan Reactor on her, increasing her mod capacity to 60 or 74 with a properly matching Aura or Universal Polarity mod like we're using here, we've added in Power Drift for some more power strength for the third and fourth abilities as well as some knockdown protection, a Flow to increase your maximum energy, Augur Message for some more duration for her Shadowgraph items, and this last slot can be flexible to whatever you have. I'd recommend a bit more strength if you're able to with the likes of Augur Secrets, or more range with Augur Reach, but use whatever makes the most sense with what mods you have available to you. On to our endgame builds, let's go over some of the stuff that'll be the same for any of the builds. First up is Focus Schools, which if I'm being honest doesn't really matter all that much and is much more of a personal preference based thing than anything. If you're looking to do long endurance runs like level cap, I'd recommend using Matter Eye for the damage. If for some reason you're running into energy problems, which you really shouldn't with Equilibrium or Violet Shards, use Zeneric, Naraman if you're playing around your melee weapons, and Unaru or Vazarin if you're wanting to be more supporty. I use Zeneric personally for the extra energy, but it doesn't really matter all that much. For Archon Shards, I'm using these here, however each build and playstyle may want a bit of a different combination, but these are my standard ones. First, we have 2 Ambers for cast speed to increase her casting a bit more as I really love high tempo casters, but you'll probably be good with just one of these if I'm being honest. Next, we have 2 Violets for making health orbs give energy and vice versa to fuel our energy economy through the health and energy orbs raining on us from her passive and to save us some mod slots so that we don't necessarily need to use Equilibrium. And lastly, I've gone with 1 Strength Crimson Shard to round it all off to help a bit with her Self-Portrait in Plein Air. However, depending on which of the Shadowgraphs you're utilizing most, you may want to make some adjustments here and there, replacing the Strength in 1 Cast Speed Shard. For my Shadowgraph build focusing on Arcane Persistence, you may want to use the Topaz Archon Shards that give more damage to enemies affected by radiation, as we'll be utilizing the Death Orb there, and for any build that you're wanting to focus on the insanity that is the Arc Traps damage, we'll swap those to Violets for increasing our ability damage against enemies affected by electric effects. But ultimately, the amount of damage her Shadowgraph summoned items do, those ability damage shards are mostly overkill, so I personally don't worry about it too much. Alright, so let's do a bit of a goofy build here first. The ultimate unkillable electric trap barrelmancer artist clown from hell. The idea with this build is that we're going to be using her Shadowgraph to throw down some arc traps around the tile, then spawn barrels for their stupid high damage, and pop those barrels with the AoE damage from her first ability by teleporting right on top of the same cast point as the barrels, which will also make us invulnerable to damage and give us some really insane movement tech which we continuously chain over and over again, making her unkillable while also dealing honestly way too much damage with the barrels and traps. When you combine that with Rhinor's Roar increasing the barrels and electric arc traps damage with its buff, the barrels are basically guaranteed to one-shot anything that's not a boss or a mini-boss in the game, with arc traps just doing their thing for extra kills, damage, and energy regeneration with Archon Stretch. Seriously, this build is insanely good fun and strong, so be sure to give it a go. I've put Roar over her balloons with this build, but honestly since I'm not really using her Self-Portrait at all because I'm playing so mobile with Force Perspective, it also makes sense to put Roar over the Self-Portrait instead if you're wanting to utilize the balloons for that armor reduction. Just make sure you throw down an arc trap first before casting Plein Air, because the AoE electric damage from the status effects can pop the balloons instantly for you. Honestly, however, Roar is kind of completely overkill, and the build still works wonderfully with no helmet, which if you decide to go that route, you won't need as much strength as I've put on my build, so just keep that in mind. Speaking of the build, here it is for you. We've got Growing Power to increase our strength a bit to snapshot into Roar's buff, but it's really not all that needed, so use whatever makes sense for you. I'm using Prime Sure-Footed because I hate being knocked down and the barrels can knock you down, but again, use whatever makes sense, like more range for the AoE barrel popping from Force Perspective, or Power Drift for more strength for Roar. But Prime Sure-Footed really does help out here. Now, I'm someone who loves having multiple forms of durability, so I'm not just leaning on her first ability's invulnerability time with the addition of catalyzing shields for some shield gating as an extra layer of protection, with Augur Reach and some more of the set on our secondary weapon refilling our shields quickly and easily with our casting rotation. Since we're summoning a ton of barrels with her Shadowgraph ability, we have Archon Stretch, Overextended, and Augur Reach for some range to help pop said barrels with her teleport, but also for the energy regeneration which is activated by the Arc Traps, and Archon Flow for more maximum energy, and its extra energy orb chance that can be procced from the cold barrels, which will also activate Arcane Ice Storm for more duration and strength to improve Roar. To further improve the helmet's buff, I've gone with Precision Intensify along with Molt Augmented, but if you're putting Roar over Self-Portrait instead of Plein Air, just swap out Precision Intensify for Umbral Intensify. And lastly, there's a Streamline just to help out with our energy economy, which is just for comfort, so swap in more range or strength if you're not having energy problems. Next, we have a more defense-focused and based build, where the whole idea is to use long-lasting summoned items from Shadowgraph, such as the Death Orb or Coralizer Turret, to do our heavy lifting with Arc Traps and barrels being thrown into the mix for extra damage, and then playing a more weapon platform from there. Here we're using my latest addiction, being Arcane Persistence for our survivability, taking advantage of the radiation from the Death Orb to generate a ton of universal orbs, as well as health and energy orbs from our passive as our healing mechanic when combined with the 2 Violet Equilibrium Shards and Equilibrium itself, along with Restorative Bond on a companion to improve those healing rates, and using Komi's Onimori to give us a bit more survivability with its 50% chance to block damage and its healing, and Force Perspective to status cleanse us and give us some invulnerability periods if things get hairy or if you need to hunt down some orbs. I personally put the helmet over Plein Air as I like having Self-Portrait for the more defense style here, but honestly put it over whatever of the two that you don't want to use. Here we're using Growing Power to give Onimori a bit more health restore and to get us pretty dang close to the 200% power strength needed for her balloons to 100% defense strip if you'd like to use that ability, or to reach the maximum amount of damage reduction from her Self-Portrait. Again, I have Prime Sure-Footed so that we don't get knocked down from our own barrels or from enemies, but Power Drift is an excellent alternative if you're wanting to use more strength for the 3 and 4 / the helmet. Next, since this build is focusing all in on those duration-based summons, we have Narrow-Minded and Prime Continuity to help those last much longer, Prime Flow for our maximum energy, along with Equilibrium, the Violet Shards to turn those health and energy orbs from the passive into more of the other, as well as boost up the amount of both that we get from Universal Orbs to be our sustain for Arcane Persistence, and those orbs will also activate health conversion for our armor to activate Persistence. Then we have Stretch here just to give the Self-Portrait or Plein Air a bit more range, but if you're not overly playing around either of those, then just throw on more duration instead. And of course, since we're playing into Arcane Persistence, we've got Umbral Intensify and Vitality to increase our strength for Onimori, the balloons or Self-Portrait, but more importantly, the extra health to play into Persistence. Finally, my preferred way to play, focusing all in on the balloons. This is much more of a weapon platform caster hybrid, as I'm using the Arc Trap summoned from the Shadowgraph to pop the balloons nearly instantly, and then using a flamethrower like the Phantasma or Ignis Wraith, or the Ceto's Altfire bouncing glaives to clean up any of the other balloons that are left over, and here's my builds for all of those weapons. With this combination, we're doing an absolutely nutty amount of AoE damage over a wide area with our high range for the balloons AoE, the Arc Trap's electricity or the barrel's damage, and of course our weapons added into it as well. Now this can either be played with or without a helmet of course, but I find that just as with the rest of the builds, Roar is excellent to increase the Arc Traps and balloons damage, as well as our own weapons damage of course, Breach Surge to play into the more caster side with the Arc Traps multiple damaged instances and the balloons AoE making the sparks constantly activate, or any other strong weapon platforming helmets like Grendel's Nourish for viral on our weapons, some additional energy sustain, and plays well into the defense removal, allowing the viral debuffs bonus damage against health to really shine, Zaku's Zada's Whisper if you're using Blast on your weapon for that interaction, giving some really nutty blast procs, which can occasionally pop the balloons as well, Mirage's Eclipse for more weapon damage, or honestly whatever you'd prefer to use. This build is very flexible in that way. I personally prefer Breach Surge here, but use whatever helmet makes the most sense for you, and all of them are going to go over her Self-Portrait as that's the least useful ability for this build, but as I said earlier, this build works wonderfully as a no helmet build as well, so give it a try to see if it suits your tastes. For the mods, we're once again using Brief Respite to regenerate our shields a bit, and I do enjoy using the 2 Augur Pistol mods as well just for some additional shield regeneration, but they aren't super necessary, just more of a quality of life improvement for the build, and again Prime Sure-Footed because knockdowns suck. Here we're going hard into range to make the balloons pick up a ton of enemies and increasing the balloons and Breach Surge's area with Overextended and Archon Stretch, with the latter giving us some free energy sustain from the Arc Trap's electricity procs. Here I've gone again with Umbral Intensify and Vitality for more health and strength, with the health orbs from the passive healing us and adaptation giving us some damage reduction. We also have Transient Fortitude along with Molt Augmented to get our strength up for Plein Air's defense strip, and to boost our damage from it and buffing our helmet of choice. I have Prime Continuity here to make a helmet buff last longer, but realistically Basically, it's not needed at all, and this is a flex spot, so swap in more range, strength, or an augment for a helmet to fit your preferences. And finally, we have Prime Flow to increase our maximum energy. For Arcanes, I've gone with Molta Augmented for more strength for our ability's damage, and Arcane Aegis for some additional survivability to play into the shields that we're generating from Brief Respite and those Augur mods on our secondary. Honestly, Follie's just incredible. She's high tempo, has insane movement tech, great squad support and utility, incredible mission improvements, and some of the highest damage in the game, especially when you're properly utilizing her summon Shadowgraph items. And while I personally have issues mainly with her passive slowing things down over too large of an area when combined with her self-portrait, even with that relatively minor complaint, she's bonkers at all levels of the game and can be built out to suit whatever playstyle you're looking to utilize. But let me know what you think of the builds, and let me know what you've done to make them your own. Again, a special thanks to those who are YouTube members, you're all champions, and as always, sub for more tips and swing by my stream if you need any help.